They called her the night ghost. Invisible. Unremarkable. Just another nurse pushing meds and charting vitals while the day's shift got the glory and the saves. Natalie Hayes had spent 18 months at St. Michael's in Norfolk, moving through the fluorescent corridors like she was made of the same sterile air that filled the trauma bays, present but unnoticed, competent but forgettable. Nobody knew. Not the residents who asked for her help with lines they couldn't thread. Not the attending physicians who watched her hands move with terrifying precision during codes and never asked why. Not Dr. Mercer, who controlled the ER like a man who'd built his career on the simple principle that nobody was watching closely enough. They didn't know what was about to walk through the ambulance bay doors. They didn't know that invisible was about to become unforgettable. The night shift at St. Michael's moved at its own pace, a rhythm that only made sense to people who'd learned to exist in the margins between sunset and dawn. Natalie arrived at 11:19 p.m., signed in at the desk without making eye contact with anyone, and moved to the locker room at the end of the east corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects. The smell of antiseptic mixed with floor wax and old coffee created a scent signature that probably meant home to most people who'd worked here long enough. To Natalie, it meant another shift where her hands would move and her mind would stay quiet and nothing would change. She unfolded her scrubs, deep blue, standard issue, the kind designed to be forgettable, and pulled on the jacket she'd worn for 6 years. Inside the lining, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a faded unit patch. It showed the profile of a leopard mid-leap, rendered in thread so old the colors had gone to grayscale. She touched it once, the way some people touched a cross or a photograph. Then she rolled her sleeves to the elbows and headed to the ER floor. The night shift had its own ecology. The drunk drivers and motorcycle accidents typically peaked around 2 a.m. The overdoses came steadier, a baseline hum of crisis that started around midnight and didn't stop until sunrise. The heart attacks arrived random and unpredictable. The stroke alerts came with their own ticking clock, a race against time measured in minutes where every second that passed was irreversible damage to the brain. Natalie moved through it all the way a professional diver moves through water, with efficiency, with acceptance, with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived much worse. The nurses' station occupied the central hub of the ER. From there, you could see into 6 of the 8 trauma bays. The waiting room extended west, always full, always angry or scared or both. The medication dispensary sat locked behind glass. The supply closet, where people went to cry or scream depending on how bad their shift had been, occupied a corner near the bathrooms. Dr. Marcus Mercer had arrived at St. Michael's 4 years ago with a reputation for efficiency and an eye for detail that made him excellent at resource management and billing protocols. He was 53 years old, wore expensive watches, and had a voice that carried authority the way some people carried weight. It was just there, natural to them, requiring no extra effort. His office sat adjacent to the ER floor, with a window that overlooked the entire trauma department. The window was the point. From that window, he could see every patient arrival, every code, every moment of crisis. From that window, he could see when people weren't following procedure. From that window, he could see Natalie Hayes. She'd been there 18 months when he first noticed her, and what he noticed was that she was the kind of nurse who made his job easier because she never caused problems. She signed in on time. She never called out. Her patients never complained. Her charting was meticulous. She was the institutional ideal of an invisible worker, present when needed, absent when convenient, no demands, no drama. Mercer appreciated this. He appreciated people who understood their place in the hierarchy and stayed there. What he didn't appreciate was the way the attending physician sometimes asked for her specifically during codes, or the way her hands moved during those moments with a kind of purposeful grace that suggested something other than standard training. He'd noted it. Filed it away. Mercer had built his entire operation on the principle that details mattered, that small observations could be weaponized into larger patterns of control. The watch cost $12,000. The car cost $70,000. The suburban home cost $4.2 million. These were the wages of attention to detail. The call came through the radio at 2:34 a.m. Ambulance 6, inbound, critical. The trauma alert siren activated, a sound that cut through the ER like a knife through water. Natalie was checking an 4 line in Bay 3 when she heard it. She didn't move faster. She didn't look up. She simply finished what she was doing and began moving toward the ambulance bay, muscle memory and training taking over the way breathing takes over when you stop thinking about it. The paramedic crew wheeled the gurney through the doors at 2:41 a.m. The patient was a man in his mid-30s, unconscious, bleeding from a compound fracture of the left femur and what looked like a pneumothorax on the left side, his chest moving asymmetrically, one side rising while the other lagged, the universal sign of collapsed lung. The paramedic was running rapid-fire through the handoff while jogging backward, keeping pace with the gurney. Navy SEAL, inbound from Bagram, blast injury, pressure dropped 17 points during transport, left tension pneumothorax, we got an 18 gauge in the second intercostal space but the hiss never came, we think it's not decompressing, vitals are crashing, his tachy at 158, BP 62/40 and falling. Tension pneumothorax. Not a simple collapsed lung, a tension pneumothorax, where air kept building inside the chest cavity, pushing the lung flat, pushing the heart against the midline, compressing every vessel in the mediastinum until the body ran out of places to put oxygenated blood. The patient went critical then, the way tension pneumothorax patients do. His oxygen saturation dropped like a stone. 42%. 38. The monitor screamed. Someone shouted code blue. The attending physician, Dr. Reeves, a former combat medic who'd spent 5 years with a Marine Expeditionary Unit before he went to medical school, looked at the chest, at the vital signs, at the asymmetric breathing, and moved toward the procedure cart. But Natalie had already moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce what she was doing. She simply appeared at the bedside with a 14-gauge angiocath needle, alcohol swab, and the kind of focus that made everything else in the room disappear. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the classic location for needle decompression in a tension pneumothorax. Her left hand found the landmarks on the patient's chest. Her right hand positioned the needle. The motion was fluid, economical, the kind of movement that only happens when the body remembers doing something thousands of times. The needle went in. There was a pause, the suspended moment where everything balanced on the edge of whether this would work. Then came the sound. The hiss of air escaping. The rush of pressure releasing. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed. 48. 55. 70. 80. The monitor's frantic screaming slowed. The SEAL's chest began to rise symmetrically again. Dr. Reeves froze mid-motion, his hand still extended toward the procedure cart, his eyes locked on Natalie's hands. He studied the way she'd positioned the needle, the angle, the speed, the certainty. Doctors trained for years to develop that muscle memory. Combat medics trained under fire to develop it faster. Regular nurses didn't develop it at all. It took something else. It took experience under circumstances that most people never encountered. It took hands that had done this before. Under fire. In field hospitals with blown-out walls and the sound of helicopters overhead. Dr. Reeves was quiet for a moment, his clinical mind processing what he'd just witnessed. Then he leaned toward Natalie, his voice pitched low so only she could hear, and said, "You've done this under fire." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of recognition from one person who'd lived that particular kind of chaos to another. Natalie didn't respond. She was already adjusting the position of the needle, securing it properly, checking oxygen saturation again, 88 now, climbing steadily. She was a nurse performing a procedure. She was invisible. She was the night ghost. She was the person who understood that staying quiet and staying focused were the same thing. But Dr. Mercer had heard. He'd been standing in the doorway of Bay 2, and the ER doors had a way of carrying sound in unexpected directions. He'd heard the paramedic's initial handoff. He'd heard the alarm. He'd heard the code called. And he'd heard Dr. Reeves lean toward Natalie and whisper those 7 words, "You've done this under fire." Mercer's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. His hand, which had been holding a tablet, went still. Because Mercer had built his entire operation on understanding people, on recognizing the small tells that suggested someone knew more than they should, on identifying threats before they became problems. And standing in Bay 1, calmly securing an emergency needle decompression with the precision of someone who'd performed the procedure in combat conditions, was a threat he hadn't known he had. The SEAL's vitals stabilized. His oxygen saturation climbed to 94. The monitor showed normal sinus rhythm. Dr. Reeves stepped back, his eyes still on Natalie, and began ordering a chest X-ray and a trauma surgery consult. The ER moved on. The crisis resolved into the controlled chaos of post-emergency protocols. Natalie stripped off her gloves and moved to the medication dispensary to continue her other patients. She didn't look at Dr. Mercer. She didn't acknowledge anything. She was a night shift nurse doing her job. She was invisible. But she wasn't invisible anymore. Not to the one person in the hospital who needed to know exactly what she was. The disciplinary notice appeared on the unit board in the main hallway on a Tuesday morning, printed in stark black letters on white paper, laminated and posted at eye level where every nurse, tech, and orderly would pass it a dozen times per shift. Natalie read it on her way to the locker room, her face expressionless, her shoulders level, her breathing unchanged. The words were there like a threat written in bureaucratic language. Disciplinary notice, Nurse N. Hayes performed unauthorized advanced procedures beyond scope of practice. Formal reprimand issued. Further violations will result in immediate termination. She stood in front of it for 6 seconds. Then she moved on, her scrubs already folded under her arm, her badge clipped to her collar. The whispers started before her shift even began. She could feel them the way soldiers feel approaching footsteps, a vibration in the air, a subtle shift in attention. In the break room that afternoon, she sat down at the corner table with her lunch, a salad and black coffee, her movements methodical and small. She took one bite. The room did not empty immediately. It was worse than that. It was choreographed. One nurse stood, said something to another, gestured vaguely toward the door. Then 2 more gathered their things. Then 3. Within 60 seconds, the table had cleared like water draining from a tub, chairs scraping against linoleum, conversations dying mid-sentence, staff drifting toward the hallway with the practiced indifference of people pretending they had never wanted to sit there in the first place. She finished her salad alone, the fluorescent lights humming overhead in that particular hospital frequency that sounded like electricity humming through a metal box. The pattern held for 2 days. Every break room she entered cleared within minutes. Every conversation stopped when she approached the medication cart. The day shift nurses who had worked alongside her for 18 months suddenly needed to restock supplies when she came on shift, their bodies turning away with the fluid automaticity of schooling fish. It was a silence maintained by collective agreement, the kind of orchestrated exclusion that required no formal order, only a unified message understood without words. She was a liability. She was a threat. She had performed something beyond the boundaries of permission, and now she lived in the space between accepted and fired, where nobody wanted to risk proximity. Dr. Mercer never left anything to chance. On day 4, he engineered the moment with the precision of a man who had spent years understanding how hospitals worked, how reputations died quietly, how a whisper in the right place at the right time could become institutional fact. Natalie was checking an elderly woman's post-op incision when the patient's daughter arrived, carrying a stuffed animal and the particular anxiety of someone who had entrusted their parent to strangers. The woman, Mrs. Chen, smiled when she saw Natalie removing the dressing. The wound was healing clean. The incision was exactly what post-op day 3 should look like. Dr. Mercer entered behind the daughter without knocking, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a blade through paper. "Mrs. Chen, I need to apologize that you've been assigned to Nurse Hayes." His words were careful, calibrated for maximum damage. "We're currently reviewing some serious concerns about her credentials and her authorization to provide care at this facility. I want to assure you that a fully qualified nurse will take over immediately." The daughter's hand flew to her mother's arm protectively. Her eyes widened, that particular widening that comes when someone realizes they have entrusted something precious to a stranger who might not be who they claim to be. Natalie's face went absolutely still. Cold. Her eyes locked on Mercer with the kind of flat, glacial stare that comes from 18 years of watching people die and deciding not to react. She did not tremble. Her voice did not crack. Her hand stayed loose at her sides. "Your concerns are noted, Doctor," she said, each word placed with the precision of a surgical instrument. The voice itself had changed, lower, harder, stripped of the deference she had maintained for 18 months. It was the voice of someone who had stopped asking permission. The daughter demanded a different nurse, her anxiety now transformed into protective anger. Mercer escorted her to the hallway with a hand at her elbow, his voice carrying back through the open door loud enough for the waiting room to hear: protocol violations, patient safety, concerns about unauthorized procedures. Mrs. Chen looked at Natalie with confusion and betrayal written across her face, and Natalie simply continued removing the old dressing, her movements economical and sure. By the end of the week, the message had crystallized into institutional fact: Nurse Hayes was a problem that needed solving. The call came on Friday afternoon. Mercer's office. Not a request, his assistant's voice on the phone made that clear: "Dr. Mercer needs to see you. Now." Natalie clocked out and walked down the hallway to the administrative section, past the plaques of previous hospital directors and the framed photographs of board members in expensive suits. His office had a window overlooking the parking lot and Norfolk's grey skyline beyond. He did not offer her a seat. He stood behind his desk, his face already flushed with the particular rage of someone whose system of control was being questioned. "You waltz in here with your little procedures," he began, his voice rising with each word, "playing hero, pretending you're something you're not." He went on for 10 minutes, each sentence designed to dismantle, to humiliate, to establish absolute dominance. He questioned her credentials, her judgment, her right to practice medicine at any level. He told her that she was a liability, that her unauthorized actions endangered patients, that her presence at St. Michael's violated every protocol and standard the hospital maintained. "You will be terminated unless you resign immediately," he said, his knuckles white against the desk. "And frankly, I'm doing you a favor by giving you the choice." He waited for a response. For trembling. For tears. For the kind of breakdown that would confirm his narrative about an unstable person playing dress-up in scrubs. Natalie listened without moving. Her breathing remained slow and controlled. Her hand stayed loose at her sides. No flush rose to her face. No moisture gathered in her eyes. She simply stood there, absorbing his words the way a tank absorbs small arms fire, unmoved and immovable. When he finally stopped, chest heaving, shoulders squared for her apology or her panic, she let the silence stretch. 3 full seconds. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed. Rain began drumming against the window like a persistent warning. Then she spoke, her voice level as concrete. "You bill like a man who's never had to account for anything. Enjoy it while it lasts." She turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her. She did not run. She did not rush. She simply walked down the hallway toward the locker room, her pace steady, her chin level, her badge still clipped to her collar. Behind her, Dr. Mercer stood frozen, his mouth open, his face moving from purple to a deeper shade of crimson. By the time he moved toward the door, she was already gone. But she was not disappearing. Not yet. 3 days later, on a Monday morning at exactly 6:22 a.m., the Navy SEAL's monitor in the ICU began to spike with irregular rhythms, the smooth waves of sinus rhythm suddenly fracturing into something jagged and wrong. The dressing change was supposed to be routine, a simple check of the surgical site, a verification that the emergency repair from 3 days earlier was holding. The day shift nurse did not expect the vessel to suddenly give way. Did not expect to watch bright arterial blood pool across white gauze in the space of a single breath. Did not expect the patient to begin seizing, his entire body convulsing as his brain screamed for oxygen his damaged heart could no longer provide. The code alarm sounded at 6:49 a.m., that particular electronic wail that every hospital worker recognizes as a summons to emergency. Natalie was in the supply room 3 corridors away, organizing chest tubes and suture kits, when the sound cut through the usual morning hum of the hospital. She moved without hesitation, already running before the intercom crackled to life, calling for trauma team to ICU, before the loudspeaker announced the code, before her brain had even fully registered what her body already knew. Muscle memory. Training. 6 combat tours where every second mattered. She burst into the ICU bay at a run. The scene was chaos trying to organize itself, the day nurse frozen at the bedside, a resident calling for the attending, monitors screaming in overlapping alarms, nurses gathering with crash carts. The SEAL's chest was open at the surgical site, sutures torn, the careful repair she had witnessed 3 days earlier splitting apart like a house of cards in high wind. Blood covered his chest. His eyes were rolled back. His oxygen saturation was falling, 88, 84, 79. The trauma team was locked in surgery. 20 minutes minimum before anyone could reach this bay. The SEAL would be dead in 4. Natalie saw it immediately, the pressure building in the thoracic cavity, the failed repair, the vessel that needed direct control. She shoved through the crowd with the absolute authority of someone who had already made the decision, already committed to the path. She grabbed the crash cart, yanking it to bedside with a metallic crash that cut through the ambient noise, and pulled open the instrument drawer. A resident shouted, "What are you doing?" But she was already moving, her hand steady as surgical lasers. She pulled out a 10-blade scalpel. "I need clamps. Size for chest retractor. Get me suction now." The voice that came out was not a question. It was a command, the kind of command that made the younger nurses move without thinking, muscle memory responding to authority even if they did not understand its source. She made the incision with practiced efficiency. The kind of economical precision that comes from performing the same procedure in blown-out field hospitals under mortar fire, where hesitation meant death, where wasted motion meant bleeding out on a dust floor at Bagram Air Base. Blood welled up and she was inside the chest cavity, her gloved fingers finding the torn vessel, applying direct pressure while calling for clamps in a voice that cut through panic like a blade through paper. The room went absolutely silent except for her calm, clipped instructions. "Clamp here. Now. Suction. Get the retractor wider. I need light on that vessel." A younger nurse assisted, her face pale but focused, handing instruments with the steady hands of someone who had found themselves in the presence of someone who actually knew what she was doing. Natalie performed the emergency repair on the ICU floor, her movements economical and exact, no wasted motion, no hesitation, no space for doubt. The SEAL's oxygen saturation climbed, 72, 78, 84, 91. His heart rate stabilized from the frantic 147 it had been to a steady 102. The monitor's frantic beeping slowed to a rhythm that meant survival, that meant he would see tomorrow. She closed enough to hold him until the trauma team arrived, then stepped back, blood covering her scrubs from chest to knees like a uniform from a war nobody in this hospital understood she had already fought. The resident stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. The attending trauma surgeon arrived at a run, took one look at the open chest, the controlled field, the evidence of someone who had actually performed advanced cardiac surgery in an emergency, and asked quietly, "Who did this?" Before Natalie could answer, before anyone could move, Dr. Mercer pushed through the crowd, his face purple with fury. He had been watching from the hallway. He had seen everything. 72 hours. 3 rotations of night shift nurses, 240 breakfast trays, 1 Navy SEAL still breathing because of hands that didn't belong in a supply room on the 3rd floor. Natalie stood between stacked boxes of sterile gauze and for tubing, inventory clipboard in her lap, when the ICU alarm screamed. Not the soft chime that meant a monitor needed attention. The full-bodied wail that meant a patient was dying. She didn't move. Didn't look up. The supply room had fluorescent lights that hummed like insects trapped in plastic, and she counted the hum, 1, 2, 3 seconds, before footsteps thunderclapped down the hallway outside. Nurses running. That was the rhythm of the ward, crisis, response, either recovery or a body draped in white. She'd been invisible for 72 hours. That was the point. Keep your head down. Let Mercer circle back to whatever calculations he was making about her future at St. Michael's. Let the attending physicians who'd recognized something in her needlework last week move on to easier patients. Easier lives. The alarm kept screaming. Then came the overhead page, the one that made even supply room nurses straighten. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. I repeat, Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Not ICU. The main emergency department. The Navy SEAL, she knew before knowing. The only patient in this hospital who'd arrived with the kind of wound that didn't fully heal in 72 hours, even with surgical precision and modern antibiotics. She set the clipboard on a cardboard box of saline bags and didn't move. Not yet. Moving was choice. Acknowledgement. Staying still was survival. But the footsteps in the hallway were wrong number of people, wrong direction. The trauma team should have been moving from the adjacent OR to Trauma Bay 4. Instead, someone was running past that intersection entirely, and the overhead crackled again. OR 2 in active surgery. OR 1 in active surgery. Trauma Bay 4, minimal staffing available. The entire surgical capacity of the hospital was locked in 2 operating rooms, and the Navy SEAL was crashing down the hallway with nobody to catch him. 3 seconds of silence. That's how long it took for her hands to stop shaking. Hand steady as a surgical laser, the attending had said, watching her work. Hands that had held lives together through 37 combat extractions. Hands that had learned on a desert airfield in Kandahar, where the surgeons were field medics and the operating tables were Kevlar blankets and the only anesthetic was knowing that stopping meant everyone died. She was on her feet before the thought finished. The supply room door swung open, and she was moving, not running, moving like someone who'd learned that panic was a luxury you couldn't afford when people were bleeding out. The trauma bay was 40 meters from the supply room, and the hallway smelled like antiseptic and the copper iron stench of massive hemorrhage. Blood had its own gravity, its own scent, and once you'd smelled a man bleeding to death, you never forgot it. The scene was controlled chaos, 1 nurse, maybe 2, attending to the SEAL, whose dressing had come loose. Sternotomy site. That meant the breastbone, cracked open, chest cavity exposed. The sutures holding the incision together, the one she'd watched the trauma surgeon close under bright surgical lights 3 days ago, had torn. Burst open like old thread pulled on a rotted seam. The SEAL's chest was open, and he was hemorrhaging internally, blood pooling around the margins of his ribs, his face the color of old concrete. O2 sat 62. Dropping. Heart rate 127. Climbing. The monitor's beeping was a timer counting down to cardiac arrest, and the attending physician was 2 floors away in an OR, probably wondering which surgical crisis to drop first. She didn't think. Thinking was how nurses got suspended. Thinking was how you second-guessed yourself into paralysis. Muscle memory took over, the kind that lived in your spinal cord, not your conscious mind. Her hand closed around the crash cart, pulling it closer. The scalpel was in the surgical kit, sterile in its plastic envelope. She tore it open. The blade caught the overhead lights, and for one crystalline moment, she was back at forward operating base Shank, working on a Marine whose IED wounds were so extensive that the field surgeon had stepped back and said, "He's gone," and she'd said, "Not yet," and opened his chest on a stretcher with a combat knife because they were 8 miles from a hospital and the only choice was try or watch him die. This time, she had a scalpel. This time, the lights were brilliant and white and clinical. This time, she wasn't going to let a man bleed out because the system was broken. "I need suction. Now." Her voice had changed. Not louder, quieter, actually, the kind of quiet that made people move faster than a shout ever could. The one nurse looked at her, and Natalie saw the moment of hesitation. Who was this woman in regular scrubs, not trauma scrubs, not an attending, giving orders like she owned the bay? And then the nurse's eyes registered the absolute certainty in Natalie's hands, the absence of doubt, and moved. The suction catheter was in place before the next heartbeat. Natalie made the incision along the existing sternotomy site, extending it, deepening it, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in blown-out field hospitals where the anesthesia was morphine and hope. Blood. So much blood. But visible now, manageable now. The ribs were in the way, they always were. She needed access to the heart, needed to see what was tearing, needed to control the hemorrhage before this man's blood pressure dropped below 70 and his brain started dying. Rib retractor from the tray. The large one. She didn't look up. Her eyes were on the chest cavity, on the raw pink tissue, on the sutures that had torn along the sternotomy line. The retractor was placed in her hand, and she positioned it, spreading the ribs apart, and there was the bleed. Not the heart itself, but the internal mammary artery, torn where the retractor had pulled too aggressively during the initial surgery. A bleeder that should have been ligated. A surgeon's oversight that was now a man's death sentence unless she could control it in the next 60 seconds. The crash cart had everything: hemostats, sutures, cautery. She grabbed the instrument, a pair of forceps with teeth that could clamp down on bleeding vessels, and isolated the torn artery. Control. That's all surgery was. Control the bleed, control the field, control the outcome. Cautery. Mark for setting. The machine whined. The smell of burning tissue filled the space, not the smell of roasting meat, the way people described it, but something more chemical, more wrong, the scent of living tissue being seared into submission. But it worked. The bleed stopped. The O2 sat climbed, 71. 78, 84. Heart rate dropping from 127 to 112 to 103. The body's own wisdom taking over, blood pressure stabilizing because the bleeding was stopped, because the crisis was being controlled, because someone who knew exactly what they were doing had moved in and taken command of a dying patient's body. She placed a final suture along the torn vessel, careful, methodical, the kind of precision that only came from having done it 100 times in circumstances where precision meant the difference between walking out of a hospital and being shipped home in a flag-draped box. The attending appeared in the doorway, stopped dead. His name was Dr. Chen, and he'd been the one to recognize her needlework 3 days ago, the one who'd whispered, "You've done this under fire." His eyes moved from her to the open chest cavity to the seals stabilizing vital signs, and she watched something shift in his face, not surprise, because he'd already suspected, but confirmation. Dead certainty. This wasn't a nurse who'd read about field thoracotomies in a textbook. This was someone who'd lived them. "I've got him," she said quietly, and stepped back from the crash cart. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the restraint it took to hand off a patient you'd just pulled back from the edge of death. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the weight of everything she'd just revealed in front of an audience of witnesses who were already picking up their phones, already composing the messages that would reach the wrong people in the wrong time. The surgical team moved past her, taking over, and she turned toward the supply room. Turned toward the quiet place where nobody asked questions. But she didn't make it to the hallway. Mercer was already there, and his face was the color of old wine, and his eyes had that particular gleam of someone who'd just watched everything he'd spent weeks plotting detonate in front of a dozen staff witnesses. He pulled out his phone before she'd even passed him, and she heard the first call connect as she reached the stairwell. A board member, probably, owed favors from a golf weekend where worse things than billing fraud had been quietly buried. She kept walking. Whatever came next, it was already in motion. The doors to the ICU burst open and Dr. Mercer walked straight to the nursing station, his jaw clenched, his phone already in his hand. His fingers moved across the screen with the precision of a man who'd spent years making phone calls that ended careers. The nurses pretended not to watch, but they watched. They always watched when Mercer moved like this, with the velocity of someone who'd decided to burn something down. He made the first call before he reached his office. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man activating a network he'd spent a decade building. Board members. People who owed him. People whose golf memberships he'd sponsored, whose children's medical school applications he'd supported with carefully worded letters. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. By the time he hung up, 2 hospital board members had already committed to reviewing Natalie's credentials. The second call went to a contact at Johns Hopkins. A surgeon Mercer had mentored 15 years ago, someone whose fellowship recommendation had opened doors that wouldn't have opened otherwise. The call was framed as professional curiosity. Mercer wanted to verify Natalie's training history, her references, her actual experience. He needed to confirm her surgical background before the hospital faced a liability crisis. The Hopkins contact agreed to make some calls to check with medical schools and surgical programs where Natalie's credentials were supposedly verified. The third call was to a firm that specialized in background investigations. Mercer knew the owner personally. They'd met at a medical conference in Charleston, had drinks, had discussed the epidemic of falsified credentials in nursing. Mercer explained that he suspected one of his staff had misrepresented her qualifications. He needed a full deep dive. Employment history, education verification, financial records, any anomalies that might indicate identity fabrication. Money was no object. Speed was essential. Within 40 minutes, the investigative firm had accessed Natalie's sparse references. The surgical training she'd listed came back incomplete. The institution she'd named either had no record of her or had records that ended abruptly in the mid-2010s. The references listed on her original application were either disconnected numbers or people who claimed to have never heard of her. It was as though someone had carefully constructed a paper trail and then deliberately erased it, leaving just enough to pass cursory verification but nothing that would withstand scrutiny. Mercer pulled up her employment file on his computer, scrolling through the scanned documents. High school diploma from a Virginia public school. Community college nursing prerequisites. An associate's degree in nursing. Then a gap. Then a bachelor's degree from a university in Maryland, but the transcript was strangely vague about prerequisite courses, the timeline didn't quite align with normal program progression, and 3 separate phone calls to the registrar's office yielded employees who seemed unusually hesitant to confirm details, speaking in careful language about privacy regulations and classified student records. That phrase, classified student records, made something shift in Mercer's thinking. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled against his chin. Classification implied federal clearance. Federal clearance implied military. Military records, if they existed, would be buried under layers of security that no civilian hospital administrator could penetrate. That meant if Natalie had a military background, it was the kind of background that came with federal protection. The kind that made her disappear from civilian databases. The kind that meant she wasn't actually just a nurse. Mercer's face flushed. His hands made fists against the desk. He'd been backed into a corner by someone whose actual credentials were so far above his that he couldn't even verify they existed. She'd worked on his unit for 18 months, and she was possibly something he didn't have the clearance to understand. And she'd just saved a Navy SEAL's life in his emergency room using techniques that no civilian nurse should possess. But Mercer had already activated his network. He'd already made calls. He'd already set wheels in motion. The board members would demand answers. The investigators would file reports. The references would keep not answering their phones. And Natalie would have to account for records that didn't exist, credentials that had been scrubbed, a past that had been classified. By 11:45 p.m., a suspension notice was prepared. It cited her for practicing advanced surgical procedures without proper credentialing, for performing unauthorized invasive medical interventions, for misrepresenting her qualifications on her employment application. The notice was clinical and sterile and absolutely devastating. It would stand in an employment record. It would follow her to other hospitals. It would make her unhireable anywhere in civilian medicine. At midnight, hospital security arrived at Natalie's apartment and handed her an envelope. She signed for it without speaking, her face blank, and closed the door. She sat on the edge of her bed and read the words that confirmed what she already knew: suspended pending investigation, badge deactivated, access to the facility revoked effective immediately. The envelope included a form requesting her to surrender her hospital credentials within 24 hours. The next morning, she returned to St. Michael's to clear out her locker. Security walked beside her. Protocol for suspended employees, they said, though the protocol was usually reserved for theft investigations and violent incidents. the hallway was crowded with day shift staff arriving for their shifts. Natalie walked past them in her civilian clothes, her uniform folded in a canvas bag, her badge already deactivated and lifeless in her pocket. The day shift nurses who'd worked alongside her for 18 months suddenly became very interested in the floor, in their phones, in the coffee station. No one made eye contact. No one spoke. This was the part of hospitals that nobody talked about, the speed with which a suspended colleague became invisible, as though association with her might somehow taint them. By 4 in the afternoon, her locker was empty. By 7, the hospital's security system had updated her access credentials, denying her entry to every door. She'd been erased from the system faster than she'd ever been integrated into it. At 3 in the morning, Natalie sat in a booth at Mickey's Diner on Granby Street, the only customer besides a drunk sleeping against the wall in a corner booth, his jacket serving as a pillow. The fluorescent lights above her head buzzed with the ceaseless complaint of aged electrical systems, casting everything in a sickly yellow wash that made her skin look cadaverous. The cracked vinyl seat stuck to the back of her thighs. A chipped ceramic mug sat in front of her, coffee long since cooled to the temperature of dishwater, a thin film of cream congealing on the surface like the skin forming on a wound. She stared at her reflection in the black liquid. The image wavered, distorted, ghost-like, barely there. The fluorescent light above reflected off the coffee, creating a halo effect around her face that made her look like something already half gone, already transitioning into nothing. The waitress refilled the mug without asking, without making conversation, without any indication that she recognized Natalie or cared about her story. The waitress had probably served 1,000 suspended workers in this diner at 3 in the morning. She knew better than to speak. Natalie's phone sat dark on the table. No calls. No texts. No one from the hospital had reached out to defend her or question the suspension. No one from the surgical team had called to say they believed her. The attending physician who'd watched her save the Navy SEAL had made no attempt to contact her. Even the SEAL himself was beyond her reach, hospitalized in a room she was no longer permitted to enter, recovering from a procedure she'd performed while his blood was still wet on her hands. She thought about the 18 months before this moment, before the ICU code, before the field thoracotomy, before the flawless needle decompression that had made the attending physician freeze mid-suture. For 18 months, she'd been almost normal. She'd had a job. She'd had a routine. She'd had the possibility of a life that wasn't classified, wasn't compartmentalized, wasn't buried under layers of security clearance that made her essentially non-existent to the civilian world. Kandahar had ended that possibility. An operation that had gone sideways had ended it. A decision made at command level to scrub her records, to bury her identity, to transform her into someone who'd never officially existed, that had set her on a trajectory that led inevitably to this moment, sitting in a diner at 3 in the morning, her reflection wavering in cold coffee, wondering if she'd survived 6 combat tours, 17 documented kills, a Navy Cross citation, and 48 surgeries performed under fire only to be erased by a man stealing from insurance companies. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the unit patch, the faded fabric that had been sewn into the lining, the only physical evidence she carried of who she'd actually been. The colors were almost invisible now, the thread loose in places, the embroidered insignia barely distinguishable from the surrounding material. But she could feel the shape of it against her fingertips. She knew exactly what it represented. She'd carried this patch through Helmand province and through the mountains around Bagram. She'd stitched it into her jacket lining the day before her identity was officially erased, a talisman against the possibility of complete annihilation. The drunk in the corner booth shifted, made a guttural sound, and didn't wake. The diner hummed with the sound of its own machinery, refrigerator compressor, ice machine cycling, the faint crackle of the radio playing something country from 15 years ago that nobody listened to. She paid in cash. For $1.73 for 3 cups of coffee and the kind of anonymity that only a stranger in a late-night diner could provide. She stood, buttoned her jacket, and walked toward the door. The bell above the frame chimed as she pushed through, a small sound that echoed in the empty diner like the closing of a chapter. Outside, Norfolk was dark and empty. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement from an earlier rain. The air tasted like salt and diesel and the particular staleness of early morning when the world had been asleep for too long. She walked without destination, without plan, just moving because sitting still felt like surrender, and surrender was something she'd never learned how to do even after 6 tours, even after being buried alive under classification. The pre-dawn darkness swallowed her whole. A week passed in the kind of silence that follows erasure. 7 days of Natalie's existence compressed into nothing, no badge, no shifts, no name on any roster at St. Michael's. She'd survived worse. 6 tours had taught her that survival wasn't about comfort, it was about motion. Keep moving. Keep breathing. Don't let the weight of what you've lost pin you to the ground. The pre-op bay at St. Michael's was a controlled space, fluorescent lights humming their monotonous frequency, machines beeping in syncopated rhythm, the smell of antiseptic layered over something darker underneath. Natalie wasn't supposed to be there. Her suspension was absolute, her access revoked, her presence grounds for immediate escort by security. But she'd walked in anyway that morning, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a name that belonged to someone else now, someone the hospital had already decided didn't exist. The protected witness arrived at 08 for 7 hours. Not a name. A designation. A Taliban commander turned CIA asset, bundled through the emergency entrance in a medical transfer that had required 4 security briefings and a federal escort. Natalie was standing near the medication station when the gurney rolled past, when she saw the face on the stretcher and felt something lock into place in her chest, a recognition so profound it bordered on prophecy. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. The commander's face shifted from blank assessment to absolute certainty. His hand rose fractionally from the stretcher's rail, a micro-gesture that meant everything. He spoke, voice low and steady, the words in Pashto falling into the pre-op bay like a stone into still water, Shaba Palang. The night leopard lives. Not a question. A confirmation. He'd seen her face exactly once before, in the wreckage of a compound in Kandahar province, blood on her hands, her medical bag open, moving between wounded soldiers with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd learned to function in hell. He'd watched her work for 17 minutes before the American air support changed the tactical situation. The night leopard. The call sign she'd buried so deep she'd almost believed it was mythology. The medical team froze. One of them, a Marine liaison officer in dress uniform, standing at the ready for clearance protocols, watched the exchange with sudden, terrible clarity. His tablet was already in his hands. He pulled up the secure database without hesitation, his fingers moving with the precision of someone reading a script he'd memorized years ago but never expected to deliver. Captain Natalie Hayes, he read aloud, his voice cutting through the pre-op bay like a scalpel. Navy Medical Corps. Silver Star. He paused. The next words came slower, each one heavy with weight. 2 bronze stars with Valor. Purple Heart. Another Purple Heart. And a Navy Cross. The room went dead silent. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before Dr. Mercer burst through the swinging doors like a man on fire, his face already mottled with rage before he even registered what had changed. He saw the security detail, the federal presence, the Marine officer standing rigid with his tablet still raised. He saw none of it clearly. He saw only the opportunity to reclaim control, to eliminate the threat that had been humiliating him since she'd walked out of his office with that glacial stare and those 7 words, "You bill like a man who's never had to account for anything." "I'm demanding the immediate arrest of that fraudulent nurse," Mercer shouted, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who'd never learned what consequences looked like. She falsified credentials, endangered patients, and violated every protocol in this hospital's code of conduct. A 2-star general stepped forward. The movement was small, economical, the kind of motion that came from someone who'd learned to speak through presence rather than volume. His uniform bore the insignia of Joint Special Operations Command. His face was weathered in a way that suggested he'd spent significant portions of his life in places where softness was a liability. The general saluted. Not a gesture of deference, but something else entirely, acknowledgement. Recognition. The kind of salute you give to someone who's held the line when it mattered. Mercer's voice died in his throat. His face cycled through colors, rage to confusion to something approximating understanding, but not the useful kind. The kind that came too late. Pentagon officials arrived within the hour. The suited woman who entered the hospital administrator's office had the kind of bearing that suggested she'd briefed presidents on classified operations in darkened rooms. She carried a federal subpoena in a manila folder, and when she addressed Natalie, using the call sign like it was her legal name, something shifted fundamentally in the building's power structure. Sparrow 6, the woman said, and the call sign landed like confirmation of reality. We need to discuss Dr. Mercer's actions and their impact on witness protection protocols. She turned to face him then, her expression the kind of calm that preceded destruction. She handed him the subpoena without looking away. You've compromised a federal asset through harassment and interference with patient care. That's a federal offense. These charges will be handled outside civilian courts. Mercer opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. The words, when they finally came, were something approximating a whisper, I didn't know. That's the problem, the suited woman said. Exactly the problem. By the next morning, the scope of what was happening had become visible. Pentagon officials had seized his office computer. Federal agents walked past gaping staff members, carrying boxes of files, their presence transforming the administrative wing into a crime scene. Insurance fraud investigators were cross-referencing his billing patterns, the phantom procedures, the inflated equipment orders, the $2.3 million that had moved through his network of shell companies like blood through compromised veins. But the real destruction came from an unexpected direction. A patient's family member had filmed Mercer's patient room humiliation of Natalie the moment he'd loudly questioned her credentials in front of Mrs. Chen and her daughter. After learning from news coverage who Natalie actually was, the daughter posted the video to social media with 4 words, "This doctor humiliated a Navy Cross recipient." The video went viral in 6 hours. 17,000 shares. National news picked it up by evening. Veterans groups amplified it through their networks. By the next morning, Mercer's own medical school mentor, Dr. Raymond Chen, a decorated combat surgeon from Desert Storm who'd trained him 2 decades ago, published an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine. The title was simple, When Medicine Forgets Honor. The words inside were a public disowning so thorough it seemed to erase the entire relationship. I trained Dr. Mercer to heal, not to destroy. His treatment of Captain Hayes represents everything wrong with modern medical administration. I regret my association and withdraw any professional endorsement. The editorial triggered an automatic board review under the hospital's ethics charter. His medical license came under state investigation. Insurance companies filed civil suits for fraud recovery. His attorney negotiated desperately, but the evidence was overwhelming and the public outrage made any quiet settlement impossible. St. Michael's terminated him within the week. Security escorted him out the same doors where Natalie had been removed just days before, carrying a box of personal items and something approximating the recognition that he'd misjudged the game entirely. By month's end, his wife had filed for divorce. His country club membership was revoked. His name became shorthand in medical ethics courses for professional misconduct. 6 months later, sources reported he was teaching CPR certification courses at a community college in Virginia Beach for $18 an hour, his medical license suspended, his career reduced to the kind of obscurity that felt like a living entombment. He drove a 15-year-old sedan now and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment where the walls probably heard him calculating how it all fell apart. 3 weeks after the federal investigation concluded, Natalie stood in the St. Michael's Hospital lobby in her Navy Medical Corps uniform, the dress blues pressed and formal, her ribbons displayed in proper order across her chest. The hospital had offered her a position as Director of Emergency Medical Services. She declined politely. She'd been recalled to active duty instead, assigned to train the next generation of combat medics at Portsmouth Naval Medical Center, teaching them the things that couldn't be found in textbooks, the things you learned by surviving when survival seemed statistically impossible. But today she was here for the Navy SEALs discharge ceremony. The man whose life she'd saved twice, once in Bagram under fire, once in the emergency bay when his sternum opened and his heart had stopped beating. He walked out under his own power now, one of his arms still favoring the side where her needle had decompressed the pneumothorax, but walking nonetheless. His family surrounded him with tears and laughter, and his youngest daughter held his hand like he might vanish if she let go. He found Natalie near the entrance to the lobby, extended his hand, then pulled her into a brief, fierce hug. "You brought me home," he said quietly. "Twice." As Natalie turned toward the exit, a young corpsman entered the lobby, barely 20 years old, fresh from basic training, reporting for his first day as a hospital liaison. He noticed something as she passed. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, partially visible as her coat shifted in the light. The insignia was worn almost transparent, the fabric thin from years of being carried through Kandahar province, through Bagram, through Helmand, through the long impossible months when every day was a negotiation with mortality. He recognized it. The training materials had shown him that insignia. The legendary combat medical unit that had held the line when everything else had broken. Without hesitation, without a single moment of doubt, the corpsman stopped. Came to rigid attention. His hand snapped to his forehead in a salute held with parade ground precision, the kind of salute that wasn't taught anymore but that soldiers somehow still remembered how to execute. Natalie paused. Met his eyes. And in that moment saw herself 8 years ago, young and uncertain and desperate to prove worthy of the uniform she was barely old enough to wear. She returned his salute with exact formality, her hand held at her forehead for exactly 3 full seconds, honoring not just his respect but the chain of service that connected them both. Command of line. Continuity of sacrifice. The unspoken agreement between those who'd chosen to hold the weight when no one else was strong enough. She dropped the salute and nodded once. A small acknowledgement. The corpsman remained at attention until she'd walked through the doors. Outside, November sun broke through Norfolk clouds, cold and clear. Natalie pulled her jacket closed, feeling the weight of the patch against her ribs, the fabric worn thin from years of carrying it through war zones and hospitals and the long silence after. She'd spent 18 months invisible and unremarked, healing in the darkness, saving lives without credit or recognition. And when she'd finally stepped into the light, when the truth of who she was had become impossible to hide, it had brought an entire hospital to its knees. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. And she'd done it every single day, long before anyone knew her name. If you made it this far, you saw exactly why underestimating the quiet ones is the last mistake powerful people ever make. Subscribe for more stories about people who change everything when nobody's looking, and let me know in the comments, what would you have done in Natalie's position, stayed silent or walked away?